Hi everyone, this is Kevin Kotz. I'll be your instructor for the history of ancient Greece. And this slide, I just have a few contact details. So in terms of my email, you can see that down at the bottom. Um, and I also have student hours on Wednesdays from 1 to 2. And as I said before in another video, you can certainly make an appointment to see me. Now what you're looking at on this slide is a fairly famous vase. And what you have on it are Achilles and Ajax. And if you watched the movie, The Trojan War, or read the book, you know that these are very famous characters from a book titled The Iliad. And what they're doing is playing a game. And these vases are quite, you can see quite a few of these if you go into most ancient history museums. And they've survived because they're normally buried with people. They're given away as prizes and then they're buried and then they're dug up and they look pretty beautiful. Okay, before I start talking about the history, I do want to just give you a little introduction to how historians look at time. And some of these you've probably already thought about. So there's a couple of different ways to discuss time. So sometimes you'll see in books CE, which means Common Era. So in terms of our date, it's 2023 CE. It's also the same exact date as a religious date, which is AD. You'll probably that's the one you've heard most often. 2023 AD, it means Anno Domini, or in the year of our Lord. So it's a Christian dating system. And so it's 2023 AD, or 2023 years after the birth of Christ. You've probably also seen BCE, before Common Era. So 3,000 years ago, it would be 1000 BC. And then the dating system you've probably seen the most is BC, which kind of means before Christ. And so 3,000 years ago, it would be 1000 BC. Now, the reason I put this up here is you can see, even though you'll see CE and AD used, it's the exact same time. So 2023 CE and 2023 AD. So sometimes on my slides, I will put CE, and sometimes I'll put AD. It just depends. Sometimes when I'm writing articles or books, the publisher will tell me which dating system they want me to use. Okay, this is a timeline. Now, I don't want you to write this down. You don't need to memorize it. You just sort of know the general time frames of what we're talking about. So our course will touch briefly on what's called the Paleolithic. Now, Paleo, let me see if I can get this highlighter to work. So paleo means, the first part of paleo means old. So paleo means old, and then lithic is stone. And the next word is Neolithic. So neo means new, and of course lithic means stone, so the new Stone Age. And that goes down to about 3000 BC in Greece. And then you have these major time frames broken down into the Bronze Age, the Dark Age, the Archaic, the Classical, and the Hellenistic. And what I've done here is I've noted some of the things that we will talk about in the class. So for example, in the Bronze Age, today we're going to talk about the Mycenaean or Minoan civilization. The C in front of it stands for circa, so about 2000 BC. Give or take 100 years on either side of that. Then we've got the Mycenaean civilization I'll talk about in a separate lecture, and also talk about maybe the fall of Troy, if it actually happened. If you've read the Iliad, you probably know that story. We'll look at the Dark Ages, which is a time of collapse, usually thought of as a time of collapse in ancient Greece, as well as other civilizations that are around Greece. And then we'll look at the Archaic period, which is when the Greeks start coming out of the Dark Ages. And then the Classical period, which is a high point for ancient Greece. And then the Hellenistic period, where the Greeks start spreading far and wide. And then you've got their takeover by the Romans. Okay, in terms of like the historical things that are happening, I don't want to talk about this very long, but we know that people were living on the island of Crete. And I'll talk about the island of Crete here in just a bit when we talk about the Minoans. But there were people living there, you know, about 130,000 to 100,000 years BC. I will tell you that the dates change wildly and quickly depending on the research that's going on. But it's thought that these people were coming from Africa, probably by boat, or not probably by boat, and landed in Crete, which was a fairly fertile area, and that's where people settled. I do want to spend just a little bit of time now moving way forward um, into time and look at something called the Frankthe Cave. And I give you this map and I show you a close-up of where the map is. This is a photo of the map. So what you can see here, this is the actual cave, the Frankthe Cave. It was inhabited by people probably around 20,000 BC, maybe earlier, down to about 3,000 BC. It really depended on the water level. We know that at some points the water level was high enough to probably go into the cave, and it wasn't inhabited. And then this is a photo that someone had taken from inside the cave looking out. So it's a pretty amazing sight in terms of what you find. So if you think about it, the older material will be down lower. So when people started digging into the cave looking for historical material, they had to dig down 33 foot deep to where there was nothing else below that. When you look at the material that people are digging out, you find some food, you find some small tools. Obsidian is a very hard, sharp rock, which people have used to cut things and kill animals and so on. At this early time point, you don't see any pottery. So people have not gotten to the stage of actually making pottery. And there's also no burials that they've found. So people were not burying people within this cave. And this time period goes down to about 10,300 BC. You also have a time point, which I didn't talk about earlier, called the Mesolithic. Meso means middle. So Paleo means old, old Stone Age. Meso means middle Stone Age. That goes down to about 8,000 BC. And lots of really interesting things have been found in this time frame. So you get fish bones. Now that's not surprising. Crete is an island. However, the bones that people are finding are from deep sea fish, meaning people are getting on their boats, they're going out and fishing, they're catching fish, and then bringing them back onto land to eat them. Now you do see more obsidian, and a lot of this material is coming from other islands. So what it's telling us is that there's some type of trade route or people moving back and forth between these Greek islands. Now you start to see during the Mesolithic a few burials. So inhumation just means where they bury the whole body, or cremation is when they've burned the body. Then you move into what I think is the most important time frame in human history, the Neolithic, so the New Stone Age, which is when people started to farm. And of course, farming leads to lots of other things in terms of people staying in the same spot because they have to take care of the land to grow the food. Neolithic usually starts with something called the Aceramic period. A just means not. So no ceramics, aceramic, that's what that means. Down to about 7,700 BC. You find, and because it's farming, you start to find the domestication of animals, especially sheep and goat, and of course plants. Now, if you've taken a history course before, you know that wheat and barley are some of the earliest known plants that people domesticated. We also find evidence of lentils, so people were definitely growing food during this period. And then you come down a little bit later, to about 7,000 BC, you start to find pottery. And here's a few examples on this slide showing pottery from this period. They start to build retaining walls on the outside. That could be an indication that the water level was rising. And then you get something called the Middle Neolithic. Now, again, you don't need to write these dates down. Just know that, you know, in the early Neolithic period, they're starting to build pottery or make pottery. And then finally, you get the, you know, I give you these dates again, don't write them down, the late Neolithic and then the final Neolithic period. And that stops around 3000 BC. And again, it's probably because the water level is rising higher than what people would want to live in the cave for. So starting around 3000 BC, you've got a whole bunch of new people moving into what is now Greece. And these are referred to as Indo-European people. So India and European from the north, which is an easy route to get into Greece. And they caused lots of changes. These are people that ended up taking over Greece and then becoming part of the class of people who really take over. Now, this is a general slide, and we'll get to some of these things when we start talking about the different civilizations that the Greeks come across as they start to travel outside of Greece. We've got contacts with the Hittites, the Egyptians, a group of people called the Phoenicians, which are living in where modern-day Israel, Palestine, that area. You've got mathematics by the Babylonians, and then the Minoans are the biggest influence on ancient Greece. And I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the Minoans who lived on the island of Crete, and I'll show you a map in just a second. They had an advanced civilization by the year 2000 BC, which was quite a bit older than what's happening in Greek. And I thought I had an arrow here, but the island of Crete is right here. And then here's the mainland of Greece, so you get a feel about how far it is. And here's the scale for mileage. Now, I'm going to jump right into what's happening with the Minoans, which is not something they called themselves. The main city was called Knossos, Knossos. And this is a drawing of their palace. So again, I've jumped right in, but I don't want to spend too much time talking about this. But this is a partial view of one of their palace. And this is a really interesting building because here you find the central court. And then as you notice, look at all these buildings that are built off to the side. It looks fairly organized in terms of having straight lines. And so somebody definitely planned out this. But what's interesting about this palace is that there are so many little rooms, all these little storerooms built throughout. And this led to the Greeks calling a lot of these areas labyrinths because they were just windy, lots of buildings inside buildings. Now, I want to show you a few pictures, but I do want to warn you, as you look at these pictures, a lot of these are recreations. So there was a archaeologist who was digging in Knossos, found a lot of archaeological remains of the palace and decided to rebuild it sort of in his own image. So some of these things you'll see aren't quite what they look like. Now some are, like here's the Great Palace staircase. That was certainly the way it was, but as you can see, this wall was rebuilt. And then you get into the palace itself. So this was a fireplace here. And this is part of the palace. Now, again, some of this has been recreated. I will be visiting this site next summer, so I'll bring some pictures back from that. You've got a great room for the queen, at least that's what they've named it. You've got these beautiful mosaics and paintings up on the wall. I will tell you this probably isn't what they look like originally. I think I have a slide here showing how the archaeologist brought in artists to recreate a lot of the work that was missing. You have these beautiful pottery, storage jars having been built. Now, the Minoans had a very large fleet of ships, and they would trade with lots of civilizations around them. Now, they also had an interesting custom called bull jumping. Now, what you see here is someone standing here. The bull is running at them, and it's almost like an action shot where this person is standing here. Now the person is on the back of the bull, so they've jumped over the head of the bull on the back, and then this person back here is waiting to catch the person who will continue jumping over the bull. Now, it's an interesting mosaic because you can see sort of the patchwork. So like, for example, this piece is the original. However, this drawing is not. This is the original, this is the original. So artists came in and tried to recreate this thing based on what they found. They probably did a pretty good job. You can see most of the pieces. And you have this beautiful artwork on this jar. It's called the octopus jar, obviously because there's an octopus, but very high art during this period as well. It's really interesting when you look at their cities, they do not have walls around their cities or what's called fortifications. Why didn't they have these? Because if you look at other civilizations around, almost always the first thing they do is they build the city and then they build a wall around it. You didn't have these in the Minoan cities because they didn't have a need to have them. They ruled the seas, they were an advanced civilization, and they didn't think there was any reason to build fortification walls when there was no one around them that could invade. It's really interesting. This leads to their downfall later when the ancient Greeks go to invade. I do want to talk a little bit about another island that was controlled by the Minoans. This is the Santorini Islands. If you've been to if you've been to Greece, this is a fairly popular place to go. What you're looking at here is a map. Now it says Akrotiri, it's actually the island of Santorini. This used to be a solid island. So what you're looking at is the cone of a volcano here. And around 1600 BC, the volcano erupted, tore the island, tore the middle of the island out, and it became this sort of series of little smaller islands. It caused lots of devastation in the area. I'll talk about it in just a bit. This is the planet Akrotiri. Now, I know you can't really see this very well, but sort of similar to the palace at Knossos, where you've got buildings. Now, this one has not been planned that well. You can see a lot of sort of crooked lines and so on. It's a pretty interesting site. Now, some of the photos I show you were taken by a professor who passed away quite a while ago. He traveled all over Europe and Asia and took pictures, and then I ended up scanning a bunch of these. But the site of Akrotiri is under a ceiling just to protect it, and then just to show you a couple slides about what it looks like. Really interesting staircase. They think that it sort of broke when you had the volcanic eruption and then the earthquake that followed after that, or probably earthquakes before and then the volcanic eruption. Beautiful pottery has been found. Again, that's part of the Minoan civilization, so no big surprise. They also had writing, and I know it's a little hard to see, but it is called Linear A. Now, unfortunately, it hasn't been translated yet, so we're not quite sure. More than likely, it says the contents of the jar, but we're not sure. I mentioned this before. There was an earthquake and volcanic eruption sometime around 1600 BC. It must have caused lots of devastation because we know that soon after, probably about 100 years after this, the Minoan civilization fell to the Mycenaean Greeks, which I'll talk about in just a second. But it's thought that this earthquake and volcanic eruption in particular changed weather patterns in the area, obviously caused lots of devastation. It tore apart the island of Santorini, and then probably caused tsunamis and so on. So pretty devastating time to be living in the Aegean Sea. And then what I want to talk about in the next lecture is Mycenaean Greece. And then here's just one shot, and then here's just a little close-up so you can see the island of Crete with Knossos on it. And then I want to spend a bit of time talking about Mycenae, and I can't remember, I might have a slide or two on Pylos, which is on the other side of mainland Greece.